My name is Ben Cort, and I have a consulting company called Cort Consulting. I know. And I work mostly inside of treatment, athletics, and organized labor, helping folks think through drug policy and, most importantly, find appropriate help for folks who have substance use disorder. Well, I first became interested in marijuana when I was about 13 years old. And I came outside of a building and there was a group of homies. And one of them, Sean, handed me a joint. And that was the beginning of my expertise in what marijuana is, and certainly my interest in. I smoked a lot of weed. I'm in long-term recovery now. I got sober like 22 years ago, which is kind of a trip. And I didn't think about weed a whole lot, aside from as a part of my recovery after that. It's just another drug, something that I couldn't use because I can't contain my use like a lot of normal people can. And I didn't think about marijuana differently than anything else until 2012. And that's when Colorado was looking at changing our constitution. And somebody encouraged me to read the legislation. They said, man, this is crazy stuff, you gotta look at it. I had always been like pretty much in favor of the idea of legalization, at least like as I saw it, decriminalization. And so I was probably one of these folks who was just gonna check the yes box on Amendment 64 and what's the harm? And then I read the legislation. I'm telling you, like once through from a guy with a high school diploma, I'm looking at this and I'm seeing not at all anything that has to do with decriminalizing a substance. I'm looking at the christening of a new commercial vice substance. And I'm skeptical enough of the corporate powers that be in this country, and I am cynical enough of the way that Americans interact with addictive substances that I saw an issue with it then. So I actually ended up leaving a nonprofit that was a huge part of my life and helping the No on 64 campaign, which obviously lost. And then after that, it always stayed in the forefront of my mind through some boards I was appointed to, smart approaches to marijuana, and talks people would ask me to give, because folks always kind of wanted to hear what was going on in the ground in Colorado. And at that point, I worked for the University of Colorado Hospital, and all of the admissions for the chemical dependency treatment program there, for the addiction treatment program, came through my office. I mean, like we wrote white papers. I remember being in a conversation one time with a delegation from another country. It was from Canada years before they did this, and there's a lot of people from Denver, and we're at the Denver PD, and the people from Canada were like, whoa, what about potency? I mean, this potency thing's a real issue. And the head of the Marijuana Enforcement Division was like, well, who could have seen that coming? And we were all, if you'll recall, like we wrote a paper on it. I think I sent you about 15 emails about this. I think the biggest thing that I was afraid of, that most of us were afraid of, was when you had an unchecked commercial market being able to kind of just run rampant doing whatever it does. So that looks like aggressive marketing and advertising, because you're always going to bump into issues when you try and regulate what they can and can't say with their First Amendment right to free speech. And then the basic and simple truth that corporations exist to make money and make products just to make the money with those products. And they sell and market these things aggressively. They sell and market them aggressively to the people who consume them the most, which are the addicted, the economically disenfranchised, and the mentally ill. So we were afraid that the industry would take over and do the exact same stuff that tobacco did in the 40s and 50s and 60s, and they did. Yeah, you're considerably more inclined to consume marijuana regularly if you earn under $20,000 a year than if you earn over $50,000 a year. And since this is a substance that is, love it, hate it, whatever. When you look at big giant empirical data sets, the more you consume, the harder time you have getting employment, finishing high school, going on to achieve a college degree, things like this. The more somebody consumes, a lot of the times that translates to a lower income that they continue to earn. And so it's really frustrating from a social justice aspect to see so many more people who don't have resources consuming regularly than the people who do have resources, because to me it looks a whole lot more like generational economic disparity. So this idea of look to Colorado as the direction to go, I really like if people would actually look to Colorado. What they're doing is they're looking to Colorado, and the information that they're being given is being handed to them by the marijuana lobby. It's the Drug Policy Alliance, Marijuana Policy Project, Safer and Normal. They're like, oh, you want stats? We got stats, here they are right here. I'd love it if everybody came out to Colorado and took a look around, and instead of going on a dispensary tour, which is what all these cats do with like our mayor who's telling you what a perfect and amazing job we did, walk around with me for a minute. Come to some of the treatment programs with me for a minute. My wife sent me a picture yesterday and she said, look, new residents at Safeway. So that's our grocery store there, it's our Kroger market. And there's a little camp set up in the parking lot of it. Look, causation, correlation, I don't freaking know. But I do know that there's a whole lot more homelessness than there was before. There's considerably more crime on every front, especially the driving under the influence and people killing people while they're intoxicated on marijuana. It's not all blue skies and green grass. Like, anybody who tells you that something on the other side of a policy this change is all perfect or all terrible is selling something. And since I haven't found the people yet who are selling anything as opposed to this, I mean, this is awesome for business, for treatment. I just am one of those folks who wishes that we could work ourselves out of business tomorrow. It's because there's not economic incentive, and especially not political incentive on the other side, for people to be honest about this and to say, actually, we really screwed this thing up. Come look to Colorado and learn what we did. You're curious, give me a ring. I'm pretty easy to find, and I've actually written kind of extensively about how people could do it much smarter than we did. I'm gonna give you two answers about why weed evokes such a visceral reaction on the part of its advocates. The big words and then the practical application of it. The big words are that drugs have always existed inside of a counterculture, and marijuana has been a bit of a subculture. Marijuana is a straight up mainstream culture now, man. Like, you don't see people wearing hats that say heroin. You don't see people walking around with meth socks on, artists singing about this. In fact, I think, unless I'm way off, like the only artist who ever had the cojones to actually sing about meth was Wu-Tang, which, that's okay. Marijuana is totally mainstream. And in that it has become mainstream, there are peer groups built around it. We don't hide it. We don't like stay in the corner and like not take pride in it. There's huge pride in it, and with that pride comes identity. And so for somebody to question this thing is essentially, I think, a lot of times to question a person's identity, because so many people identify as a consumer of marijuana. And questioning identity is something we should all do fairly regularly, but it's tough, and you can't have it forced on you. And I think what happens a lot of the times is people feel like they are being, like their core belief system and their core peer group is being questioned. The other side is, and this is a little bit harsher, but it's more simple. For 40 years, you've had an industry with massive amounts of lobbying power working behind the scenes to convince people of this. And while I think that people genuinely believe that they're thinking, for the most part, I'm not saying this across the board at all, but for the most part, I can tell you the first 10 comments we're going to get. And then we can go back to the Drug Policy Alliance's website and find them inside of their mission statement. Like, this is something that people have gotten their marching orders for a long, 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 long time. And what's weird for me and what kind of sucks for me is that we have learned to question a lot inside of this country. We've learned to question politicians, we've learned to question chemicals in food, and we've learned to question tobacco, but this is one that if you even question it, people start calling you all sorts of big crazy names. And I think what that has done has kept us from having a real and honest dialogue about marijuana. I get asked that question all the time. So you're okay, you're good with it, you're bad with it, you're pro, you're anti, you know what I am? Here's the answer to that question I've been using. I am pro-logic. Wherever that takes you, rock and roll. And where I'm seeing the science point me, pro-logic absolutely says I am anti-commercialization. I can say that straight up and with pride. I am anti-commercialized marijuana. But when it comes to pro-weed, you anti-weed, you know what? Like, maybe if we stopped trying all these litmus tests and to put each other in sort of categories and actually listen to one another, Republicans might realize Democrats had some good stuff to say, Democrats might realize Republicans had some good stuff to say, and maybe the world would be a better place. So look, Senator Booker's reintroducing something that he has tried before, and while I don't know the man, I think that he's doing it for good reasons. I think Senator Booker is a guy who genuinely cares about minority communities and sees this as a solution, although it is not. The data is so simple. So in the incredibly likely chance that this lands on Senator Booker's desk and he clicks on it and sees this, you don't solve the institutionalized racism that exists inside of our country by changing one thing that black and brown people get arrested for at disproportionate rates to white people, because they get arrested at disproportionate rates for everything to white people. You start to look at the actual culture and why exists systemic racism inside of our judicial systems. That's the way that you change this. And if we continue to have this conversation about the sneeze, we are going to not have to talk about the cold, which isn't going to work. And what we've actually seen in Colorado is that considerably more people of color are affected negatively than guys who look like me, because it's the guys who look like me who own these dispensaries. And they set them up disproportionately in low-income minority neighborhoods. So this is not the solution that we all hope and dream and pray that we find for disproportionate arrest rates. It's not. The data shows us that. To your question, what do I see the future of this being? Is it federal? Is it state by state? Is it? I have no idea, Steve. And there's some things that I'll tell you for sure I think are coming down the pike. I think for sure 5 years from now, this country is going to be laughing at the days when we didn't see the link between mental illness and this high potency THC. I think that that's going to come in short order. I think that the idea that big marijuana is not a thing, those days have come to an end, and we're going to have to realize we're no longer dealing with, you know, the mom and pop shop on the corner, but we're dealing with Monsanto and Walmart and Nestle. I know those things. As far as where it ends up, honestly, man, part of it's a foot race between the distribution of the information about what's actually happening and we really know, and the money and the lobbying efforts that go into preserving that money. So my hope is that people look to Colorado critically and some of these other states that have done it, and instead of just taking what's happening in the news, they actually try to learn a little bit, and instead of just what the news reports. I hope that we really consider the environmental impacts, the social justice impacts, the mental health impacts, and the impacts on the addicted community, and that we make decisions accordingly. And I'll tell you, if nothing else, the democracy we live in says that we can do just about any freaking thing we feel like if enough people vote for it. I mean, we can put that dude who starred on The Apprentice in the Oval Office if we want to. We can go this direction if we want to as a country. But could we just breathe a minute? Because we got a minute to do this thing right, and we didn't do it right with alcohol, and we didn't do it right with tobacco. And if we could go back in time and force them to play by some strict rules and not have a seat at the table with their own rulemaking, man, I would do that in a minute. So while I don't know where we end up, or I hope where we end up, is in a slowed down, deliberate, and thoughtful approach to what marijuana policy looks like in this country, instead of this free-for-all, freight train barreling down the tracks approach that we have taken so far.